Hello, everyone. Welcome to Bird Process Equipment's educational webinar on wastewater treatment systems, so related to hazardous waste. We'll be talking primarily about the pharmaceutical industry today, but a lot of what we're going to cover will also be applicable to many other industries. I'm Mark Turgenti, the Director of Design Engineering for Bird Process Equipment, and I really hope you enjoyed the session this afternoon. As we go along, there will be a few poll questions. We are always interested in making this as interactive as possible. Feel free to type questions into the Q&A. We will try to answer all questions as they come throughout the webinar. There will also be time here at the end, and any we do not address during the actual broadcast, we will certainly answer offline. Furthermore, there'll be a brief survey at the end of the webinar. We're always interested in your feedback, both about this webinar as well as about future content. So I know this is a topic for those of you who have joined our webinars kind of extensively in the past, have kind of covered, which is, one of the specialty things that Bird Process Equipment is very heavily involved in is water and wastewater treatment. But there is some specific sort of industry nuances to it, whether you're operating in higher education, semiconductor, solar, general industry, aerospace, or pharmaceuticals, the kind of waste that's generated, the types of solutions that are involved, they do vary by industry. So when you're talking specifically about the pharmaceutical waste, there's a number of different things: CIP discharge, cage washers. There can be different types of potent or hazardous waste, from mercury waste to carcinogenic waste and biologics waste that track across the BSL 1 through 4 spectrum that need to be considered when doing any kind of wastewater treatment system. So when kind of addressing this topic, it falls into really 5 different categories: from pH neutralization, the waste lift stations that allow us to move this waste, solvent and potent waste, specialty waste, and then wastewater and also effluent decontamination systems. Today, we're going to talk more about chemical EDS and thermal EDS, and how all of those really kind of come together or can be utilized in different pharmaceutical facilities. pH neutralization is kind of the fundamental one. Whether you're talking about a CIP waste, CIP 100, 200, 300, citric acid, phosphoric acid, or potassium hydroxide, it's just used to wash down process kettles or other areas. They have an impact on the pH, both in the caustic as well as in the acidic direction. Certain processes in the pharmaceutical industry can generate waste as high as 13 to 13 and a half when using extensive cleaners. Obviously, a lot of the kind of push of sort of single use has kind of helped mitigate some of that water requirements for the system, but still, it's kind of an integral part of any system. So pH neutralization, we're going to kind of go through this a little bit in detail, is really trying to ensure really 2 things predominantly. One is the pH of the wastewater. We're always trying to achieve a pH between, say, 6 and 9 via an automated pH system. The other thing, very often in the pharmaceutical industry, is temperature. Hot Wi-Fi streams, hot sanitization systems, whether you're doing you have like a Wi-Fi still design, or you're doing thermal sand tint as part of a high purity system. A lot of different thermal waste is put down the drain as well. When I mean thermal waste, I'm talking about any waste of 140 degrees Fahrenheit. That needs to be cooled as part of the pH treatment system. So really the 3 parameters you're typically looking for kind of at the end of your pH train tend to be pH, flow, as well as temperature. So it's important to really kind of monitor and treat all of those as part of a basic pH neutralization package. So pH systems come in a wide variety between single and dual stages, obviously dependent upon the nature of the pH coming into your waste, how strong it is. If you're pushing, those more extreme waste streams, because pH is logarithmic by nature, 11, 12, 13 pH, obviously we're going to have orders of magnitude. We need to look at having a multi-stage system. Because of the high flow and also the necessity for redundancy, as well as really minimizing downtime as part of any pharmaceutical facility, they tend to use what's referred to as a fully automated system. So you see things like diversion tanks, equalization tanks, built-in integral batch control. We'll kind of go through what those all mean later. But also things like redundant pH probes, And very sort of extensive control panel packages that go along with this as well. Most of these can then be put onto is for critical monitoring for utilities onto either a factory floor or SCADA system or whatever kind of building monitoring system is part of the overall system. It is also kind of worth noting here, sort of before we get too far down the line, but a lot of sort of the green initiatives that really is even touching kind of, even the pharmaceutical industry, pH neutralization systems in general are very low energy users. When you do things like actual energy or kind of green footprint analysis, pH systems generally fall on the very low side of that. There's not actually a lot of power requirements generally tied into these types of systems. And here you can see a couple different examples. On the left, we have kind of a more straightforward kind of dual stage system with a multi-reagent package. One on the right is a much larger scale system. pH systems can range very highly in flow rate from very small streams, 5, 10 gallons a minute, scaling up to, 1,200 gallons a minute or even larger, which really become like sort of plant scale designs. And here in the center, just kind of a model of sort of how these systems kind of operate. You can sort of see the CSTR as part of the treatment tanks and that built-in integral batch interfacing that I was just talking about. And we'll kind of delve into this a little bit more when we talk about some of the different kind of systems configurations. But really, like the one in the center here, this is a typical sort of scale of system that you would see as part of a pharmaceutical waste treatment system. Is specifically designed to handle stronger waste streams, by using things, for example, like recirculation pumps, which use the waste as a carrier medium to allow you to do treatment, as well as having either integral as part of an equalization package, an integral batch design while having to maintain flow into your system. Regardless of the style of pH system, you have really four basic components. You have your treatment tanks, agitation, you have your chemical injection, and then you have your controls interface. And really what I should kind of mention here is the fourth one, which really is monitoring as part of your system. As the monitoring is obviously the reason we're doing this, to minimize that kind of environmental footprint that kind of goes along with the system. The treatment tanks, they vary wild. They really do vary considerably. I showed you a couple examples there between some large fiberglass and thermoplastic. Those are probably the most common design for pH neutralization systems. But what's really kind of critical, and this kind of goes for both pH treatment as well as if you're going to look at something like a chemical EDS system, is that you need to have a proper rate of mixing in your system. And mixing calculations obviously kind of get really into the weeds as far as sort of complications, but it's kind of a good rule of thumb. You're generally looking at about 1.5 to 2 tank turnovers per minute as part of any kind of mixing in the system. So when you have things like recirculation pumps, for example, those really aren't used, as part of the actual recirculation package. They're really meant to actually speed up the chemical injection that goes into your system. So here you can kind of see what I was just sort of talking about here. Here's a couple different examples. It's kind of a look inside of an actual pH system. So even though we're talking about according to the video here on the lower right, even though we're sort of talking about fairly high, that's really not really considered very high agitation. In sort of kind of grand scheme, we're talking about mixers or doing different kinds of blending. That's kind of what you really see as part of the system. And the waste always comes in through a down pipe. This allows it to be directed directly into that mixer backwash, so you don't get what's called short cycling as part of your system. What short cycling is, the waste comes in at the top and basically goes across sort of above that kind of mixer backwash where your reagents are then being injected. And this is to maintain residency time. So this is something you kind of hear a lot when doing pH system design is what really is kind of the residency time that goes into these types of systems. So when we talk about residency time, pharmaceutical waste is generally between 20 and 30 minutes. That can be split between 2 tanks or a single tank design. 2 tanks kind of gives you the advantage of having multiple CSTR or utility started tank reactors. So basically it allows you to move the pH more by splitting that into more of a 2 tank design at that point. Because really, that's kind of a general rule of thumb. You can basically move the pH about 2 to 3 units per stage. So if your waste is 13 or 1, for example, to really move that, say, accurately 7, barring some additional features that could be added into your system, you are going to be looking at a two-tank design at that point.
All right, at this time, we are going to have our first poll. You should be seeing it up on your screen now. These are optional, but definitely feel free to participate if you would like. And our first one here, what is the determining factor for residence time in a pH treatment system? Your options are the pH of the waste, the flow rate, the pH and flow rate, or the venting requirements. So I'll leave that up for a second if anyone wants to take a guess. All right, and it looks like just about everyone got that right. It is both the pH of the waste and the flow rate. So as Mark was saying, depending on how many units of pH you need to move your waste to be an acceptable discharge, that definitely impacts how long you need to have the waste in the system to make sure it can move to within an acceptable limit, as well as the flow rate, depending on what kind of incoming flow you have and how much size of the tank there is to do that residency time.
And really kind of to comment, residency time is really nothing more than the tank volume divided by the flow rate. So when you're really determining that, that really helps you kind of determine your tank size. If you have a 100 GPM system at 30 minutes residency time, you need 3,000 gallons of waste at that point. 3,000 gallons of volume, apologies, to maintain, say, that 30-minute residency time. When we're talking about chemical injection, this kind of comes under a lot of different kind of conversations. When you talk about active pH neutralization systems, which we are here, you basically are doing precision injection based on what's considered temperature proportional control. So you're monitoring the pH, you're monitoring the pH as part of your system, whether that's in the recirculation line or that's in the actual treatment tank. And then you're essentially pulsing in to basically match that logarithmic curve. So whether, 1,000 to 1 turn down, 100 to 1 turn down, which is why it's kind of important to use really like precision metering pumps for these types of applications. And your reagent chemicals are considerably stronger than your waste stream. So you're talking about usually using things like sulfuric acid or sodium hydroxide. There are a few other ones that can be used, which obviously can be talked about for varying situations. Those are the two most common. And the reason that they're actually utilized is one, cost. Sulfuric acid and sodium hydroxide are relatively inexpensive. Two, they have very low vapor pressure. So you don't have to really vent them or vent them through a scrubber system or vent them as part of the injection process, since they're not going to be off-gassing when doing pH neutralization reactions. Now, most of the time when doing pH neutralization reactions, you are taking what's still considered a fairly dilute waste stream, even if you're at pH 1 or pH 13, for example. So you're not going to see things like thermal rise. You're not going to see, you're not really looking at a chemical reactor system. When you have stronger waste streams, which is rare in the pharmaceutical industry, you tend to see it's more in things like semiconductor, where they may have like strong nitric or HF streams. It's a little bit of a different conversation that comes up as part of that. But by and large, 95% of pH systems are treating what's considered a weak. So that's where having that low vapor pressure of these chemicals does also facilitate that. And lastly, the other reason to really use them is just because of basically because of availability at that point. There are other ones like CO2 gas that can be utilized, which you see a lot like in beverage manufacturing or different people that use a lot of aerosols. But kind of regardless of the style that's utilized, they need to be 110% double contained. They need to be kept separated, and all the reagent plumbing, whether that's tubing or hard pipe design that goes from your reagent injection to your tank or your circulation lines, all double contained, because it is obviously the one sort of hazardous point. If you're looking at a HAZOP evaluation, as part of the system, is really going to be that chemical handling. So there are also a number of different ways to allow you to essentially move those chemicals around, whether that's between drums or having built-in transfer systems or bulk storage capacity. There's a lot of different options available for that. And I kind of went through this a little bit before, but essentially for a control scheme, pH is not a very complicated control, but it's a little bit different than what you would typically see for a lot of other systems. When you're talking about something like, for example, in pharmaceuticals, like an EDS system or chemical EDS system, those tend to operate on a volumetric condition. So you're going to measure some volume in your tank. You're going to put in your sanitary, whether that's an a bleach, or whether that's a hypo injection. Um, for specific dwell time, kind of based on a volume. You want to get a 500 ppm or 1,000 ppm to allow you to kind of go through that sort of kill process. See at this point. For pH, you're solely basing it on the pH curve at that point. What's really important is because of sort of the integral nature of what a pH system is, its environmental impact, it really comes down more to the less about what the actual control programming is, more to what the available data is from it. So as part of the monitoring, for the local municipalities, you do need to monitor the flow, the pH, and a lot of times the temperature, as I mentioned before. And temperature is typically addressed through a heat exchanger as part of the system, not actually sort of integral. You're not typically doing quenches or things like that. And you really want to design a pH system to be high temperature, because majority of the components of the pH system are designed to be corrosion resistant. They're not designed to be thermal resistant. So typical pH systems can typically operate around 160 to 170 degrees of actual waste coming into them. But obviously your discharge limits tend to be below 140 or 104 degrees, depending upon the municipality. So what you're really pulling out of the control scheme here is, alarm sequencing charts. You're pulling out that data for tracking. You're monitoring its overall condition, because really every single drain point in your building, outside of some specialty waste, is going to come through this system. So it does become a critical utility in some ways, because it ultimately is the last choke point for your facility to operate. So that's why there's a lot of different control suites, Allen Bradley, Siemens. A lot of this can be driven obviously based on what the client's ultimate sort of building integration system is. What I sort of touch on, this does come up quite a bit in the pharmaceutical industry, is sort of alkalinity. So if you're working in the pharmaceutical industry and you see things, you have a very high amount of Wi-Fi water, for example. Wi-Fi is used for cleaning, processes like that. Just via that process of sort of vapor separation that's used in those processes, you're removing most of the alkalinity from your wastewater. Um, and alkalinity is kind of important when it comes to pH treatment. When you're doing pH treatment, it's important that you have some level of buffering to allow you to have, that you can see here on the right, sort of a smooth curve that kind of comes with treatment. So if you're down around pH 1, you sort of want to be able to sort of move almost in a linear fashion as you're essentially looking to proportionally treat based on the pH curve. If you have a Wi-Fi dump, and I've seen clients that they dump 20,000 gallons of Wi-Fi water, like once a week, things like that. That, with very little chemical in there, what ends up happening is you get this sort of oscillatory curve here. Because effectively what's happening is your reagent chemicals are effectively overreacting in your system. And what can happen is it can lead to a very long amount of treatment time. So this is treatment time here on the x-axis. You can see the kind of the orange line here going to sort of way out on the curve. And so finally, by putting enough chemical in, you're actually building up some level of alkalinity as part of your system. So it's very often a requirement, which is something that's hard to see up front, that you need to be able to add an additional reagent chemical like a buffer, sodium bicarbonate, and is most common because it can buffer multi-acidic as well as the basic direction, and allow you to then get that sort of alkalinity to allow you to have a smooth pH curve at that point.
Hey, Mark, we have a question in the Q&A about reagent chemicals. The question is, are there other types of chemicals that can be used for reagents in a pH system aside from the two that you mentioned earlier?
There are really, any type of reagent chemical, and this is a good question. It comes up a lot for a couple of different reasons. They all have their pros and cons. And a lot of times, one of the things is, well, I already use like hydrochloric acid in my building, or I have safety concerns from EH&S. I want to use things like citric acid. So while any type of acid or base can potentially be viable, there are sort of pros and cons to both. I mentioned briefly before about carbon dioxide gas. Carbon dioxide gas is fairly viable if you have it on site. It allows the formation of carbonic acid when it's diffused into the system, which is a strong acid. It's relatively safe. It does does change the overall design of the system a little bit. Now you're using essentially fine bubble diffusers that get sufficient surface area to allow for the CO2 to dissolve properly. There are other things that kind of influence carbonic acid formation from CO2, like the height of the tank, temperature, things like that of the waste stream. But it is a viable alternative. Citric acid is unfortunately one that comes up a lot, and it's not a very viable alternative. And one of the problems is you really want to use a strong acid or a strong base. You can use different concentrations for various reasons. Like, for example, the famous, sodium hydroxide at 50% has a molarity of 18 to 19. However, it also has a very low freeze point, has a very high freeze point. At 55 degrees, sodium hydroxide can turn fairly gelatinous by nature, making it, infeasible in a lot of applications. If you don't have a well environmentally controlled space, or it has to be outside, things like that, it becomes very problematic. The thing with citric acid is a weak acid. So even at a very strong concentration, it has a pH of like 3, whereas say your sulfuric acid has a pH of like 0. So you're talking 10 million times stronger effectively. So what can end up happening is if you have a very large waste stream, now you're putting in a substantial volume of this chemical, even though it's safe, to basically allow you to treat pH. And by doing that, but also by using any kind of an organic acid, things like citric acid as part of your waste stream, you're also adding you're also adding COD to your waste. So you're basically increasing the chemical oxidation demand, which might cause other issues with your regulatory compliance. HCl is probably the other most common one that I see. It's okay. The issue with HCl is one, it has a very high vapor pressure, unlike sulfuric acid, so it needs better venting. You're obviously anybody who's ever been around HCl or muriatic acid, if you want to use the old terminology for it, well, you can immediately smell it as soon as you open up a jar of it. The other issue is it has a lot of pitting effect on stainless steel. So if you have a stainless steel mixer, or if you're not venting the treatment system or the reagent tank properly, most pharmaceutical industries, a lot of things are stainless steel, they're washed down. That can rapidly, even within 6 months, affect the environment that it's around. So while it's a very strong acid, chemically wise, it's fine. It has other environmental conditions that need to be taken into account if you're going to use HCl as part of your system.
And Mark, we did have one more question. Someone was asking, does BERT perform bench scale tests in-house to size pH neutralization systems?
We do not. One of the things you can do is you can do chemical modeling based on what the waste system is. Typically, you would do like a bench scale model. You do actual testing if you were looking at treating waste that was for like metal precipitation waste or like fluoride treatment waste, things where you actually want to do more of like a titration based curve, as opposed to doing sort of more of a traditional kind of CSTR sort of calculation, which is usually what you would do for most sort of straightforward pH neutralization systems. There are a couple of sort of different standard designs that we do have. One of them is our PHX model, which you don't see a lot in the pharmaceutical industry. It's just kind of a small system here, but I kind of like the model up top and on the left that kind of shows sort of the reagents, how they kind of go into the downpipe right in kind of the mixer backwash here. These are relatively small systems. They're designed for like 7 to 33 gallons per minute. This is what you would more typically see, this is more of a traditional sort of two-stage configuration. Again, it lacks some of the more sophisticated control processes that kind of go along with the system, such as recirculation and redundancies. It does offer kind of that redundant tank design, which can be utilized, like I said, to kind of meet that kind of CSTR modeling at that point. This is kind of the more common, and we kind of classify it as an ACS, which is sort of a broad categorization that you'd see typically in the pharmaceutical industry. And this is a system that has that sort of built-in kind of batch capabilities. So this is that sort of fully automated system. Standard designs go up to like 300 GPM, bigger ones go up to over 1,200 gallons a minute. These have an out-of-spec retention both built into the tank as well as through equalization packages. You also have that recirculation loop. One of the things I kind of mentioned earlier, the recirculation loop on a pH system allows you to do that sort of essentially using the waste as kind of sort of like a carrier medium. I was talking to somebody a couple of days ago, and I go, you actually need water as part of your system? It's kind of like a dilution process, and you really can't dilute in a pH system. But what you can do is you can use the waste stream to basically dilute in a way. And that's really what a recirculation pump is. It's basically using it as a carrier medium, so that rather than having, say, a basic sort of a drip injection into your pH system, what you're really doing is you're doing like a recirculation with the waste, and then you're pressurizing it and basically ducting it then into the mixer backwash at that point, which really rapidly kind of speeds up your injection, basically speeds up your pH treatment process at that point. This is sort of the model. You can kind of see kind of abrupt P and ID. It's really this sort of double sort of U-trap configuration here where you have that sort of built-in residency time. This can also be done by doing a recirculation loop back into a Q tank, which I'm obviously not showing here. But there's a lot of different ways to sort of build that in. That's really an important thing in any kind of critical infrastructure, like the pharmaceutical industry, where you want to have that ability to kind of bring the waste back at that point, or have some way to really hold that waste, and still allow for additional treatment. Because if the system goes down, everything basically upstream of it effectively goes down. So this is some information here, and stuff's available on the website as well. Where you guys can really take a look at, some of the different sizing that kind of goes into these types of systems. It is worth noting, each system's kind of based on their bank tanks, the CSTR model, different treatment tanks. They can get pretty big. So it's important, obviously, with space modeling, if you're looking at as a kind of a design engineer, this kind of information is very helpful for kind of that early sort of SD or DD phase design, where you want to be able to sort of place a system effectively, or kind of carve out footprints or utilities for the system.
Hi, Mark. We have an additional question, and they're asking, how is a chemical EDS system integrated into a pH system?
That's a really good question. So for those who are unfamiliar a little bit, kind of a little background sort of on EDS system. Effluent decontamination systems, when you have a biologics, BSL 1, 2, 3, or 4, you don't typically see chemical EDS at BSL 4. You do see a lot of it's biosafety level, is what that means. And there's a whole host of different things, from viruses, bacteria, different things that need to be kind of basically classified as part of a BSL 1, 2, or 3 model. And when doing a chemical EDS system, because you're essentially using a lot of the same sort of chemistries that are brought into a pH system, it is possible to sort of make a combined system or have one that flows into the other system. And what's really important is kind of looking at sort of two different ways that a chemical EDS system is set up. The first is you're using an exterior sanitant, the most common being bleach of some capacity. And when doing bleach, you typically have a residency time. So beyond kind of a flow through system, which we're kind of looking at here on the screen as I talk, most EDS systems are done as a batch. So either they're collected upstream of a flow through system. You don't necessarily want to combine them with all of the waste if you don't have to, because you obviously need to kind of further treat this. So if you have few isolated processes, for example, that need to sort of be biologically treated, or basically decontaminated, you can collect those separately, chemically treat them, and then transfer them into the bulk wastewater process. And by doing it with an exterior sanitant such as bleach, you're going to have to adjust the pH to allow the sanitant to be at its optimal level. So what that means is if you have bleach, for example, you're not really treating it typically at pH 13, which is where bleach typically is available in. It's basically given to you at a high pH to stabilize it. If you're going to inject an acid, you're going to lower the pH down to like just below 7. What you really want to form is hypochlorous acid at that point, which is basically the acid conjugate of hypochlorite, which is a much stronger base. That's allowed a certain dwell time. And then after the kill process over that dwell time, you then transfer it to the pH system and then be monitored and further neutralized. The other methodology, which is I think is really much more common, and that actually would be my preferred, is um, alkaline waste in general can actually be a very good sanitant. So what you're seeing a lot from sort of a safety standpoint to get away from handling things like bleach and obviously the off-gassing and then lower the pH, which obviously does not, but actually puts you closer to forming chlorine gas, is to simply effectively, like we cook the chemicals in basically a high pH solution. So most people kind of associate, what you typically do is you raise the pH of the waste stream like 13.5. Really nothing can survive biologic wise in very high caustic environments. So we've done a lot of work actually in some different facilities, even the U.S. government, for example. What they do is they essentially both raise the pH very high and they actually cook the waste at that point. You can basically destroy any biological residue at that level. But from a chemical standpoint, from a normal system, if you raise the pH up to like 13.5, and you just let this stuff basically sit there, you will kill essentially and lower its BSL rating, and then you take that high waste and then you inject it into a normal pH system, or you just simply add an acid at that point. It's just a simple system to lower the waste back down to a level to be discharged. Little model that's been running in the background. I've been talking. This is kind of how a pH system operates. You can kind of see the reagent injection. We have our treatment tanks here, overflow. There's your monitoring, recirculation lines. So this kind of gives you sort of a very visual kind of dynamic of some of the things that I've been talking about today, and sort of how they flow as part of the pH system that really goes into a system. Just a few highlights here, because obviously we just talked a lot. These systems, they run the gambit quite a bit, and I sort of showed you guys a few different examples of two-stage systems, and the model is kind of going through like a sort of a batch hybrid, and let's describe EDS systems that can tie into chemical. The pH systems run a lot, and this is just one example from a large sort of pharmaceutical facility where they have such high waste streams, they actually have the waste going to outside fiberglass tanks. And at that point, pH adjustment essentially becomes a form of like a chemical injection system. So this is like a fully containerized design. So not all these systems are skidded. As you might expect, it's kind of a pre-package. A lot of them are more sort of a modular or containerized design that kind of highlights this, sort of shows that this is basically doing that recirculation, you're doing that chemical injection, you're doing all that monitoring, but you're doing it for essentially like an off-site tank design. And by putting this in a containerized system, that brings other things up, like you see maybe you have safety features like chemical showers and you have fire suppression systems, double containment. So it was kind of nice about this is you can do a nice sort of modular design in a building and just drop it on site with having very little impact as far as putting this into an actual building or doing a lot of on-site construction as part of that operation. Same thing here. This is just another example showing how this is making more like a chemical feed configuration. And not all pH is actually done on the waste side. A lot of pH adjustment is actually done for generation, for example, if there's a critical utility plant on site, when they're doing things like when they have like very high or very large amounts of DI generation, you can use pH adjustment to do like resin regen as part of those types of systems. So there's kind of a lot of other ways that sort of pH adjustment like this is sort of utilized as part of the pharmaceutical or really a lot of other sorts of industries. And then lastly, obviously, when you talk about very big systems, you can kind of see the scale of these systems that can be located outside, for example, because of their scale. Fiberglass is more common for some of the bigger systems, but fiberglass as a whole is not entirely, um, you know, better, quote unquote, than say like a thermoplastic. They sort of have their pros and cons. Not all, some of them are lower temperature. It really depends on the type of resin and corrosion barriers that are utilized as part of fiberglass. Fiberglass is also inherently weak to potassium hydroxide, which is a major constituent of a lot of pharmaceutical waste. So it's kind of important to sort of understand that as well. But for very large systems like this, 400 or 500 gallons of 800 GPM, And then you can see things like panel air conditioners, things like that kind of get built in. You're talking about more of an outside-based system design. Not all waste systems inherently need, to have that, you know, how do you really get the waste there, obviously? So fluid, kind of like waste handling is kind of a sort of a subset that can entail things like lift stations, for example, which we're looking at here, which is how I bring all these different processes from my facility to a wastewater treatment system. But also it can be how do I hold and move different sort of specialty waste? It needs to be either collected or taken off site, whether that's going to be solvent or hazardous chemicals. You're talking about different alcohols, for example, acetone, things like that. Or even, obviously much stronger waste stream, or even some different types of biohazard waste streams if you want to bring that to more of like a thermal EDS system. So there is, sort of a couple of different types of systems that are kind of utilized to do that. And this is kind of what this kind of model here is showing. Obviously, different types of pump technology from like verticals, air operated, for example, if you have things like explosion proof areas, or even things such as like cell primers. If you want to look at doing pumps that need to be located above, where you have a very high suction lift, or if you don't want the pump in the waste stream, if you're dealing with a very strong waste stream, for example, that can be utilized, something that doesn't actually want to have, for example, like operator safety, can become very much a primary concern at that point. So very small lift stations, things that are like under the sink are sort of specialty, they have, more of a simplex design. Simplex is obviously not common when you're talking about different types of like waste transfer systems. It really is only utilized when you don't need redundancy of a single process. See, downtime is not very important as part of these types of systems. Duplex is by far the more common method. Where a duplex lift station, you have that built-in redundancy. You have it the way it gets to a certain point in the system. You can activate the second pump, or you can run both pumps in parallel to get that sort of higher level of flow that's required for your system. And there's a lot of different things. I kind of showed you in that model there, we showed some different pump configurations, but these things can come in a lot of different styles. Very large system like the one on the right there, for example, for high flow waste, stainless steel for different types of thermals involved. You have, for example, like condensate blowdown, that can be a stronger waste stream, or more of like a bulk sort of stream, like the one you see on the left, which is more like a triplex configuration as well.
All right, at this time, we are going to do our second poll. You should see that popping up on your screen now. And the question here is, what would be the reason to use duplex pumps on a lift station? Your options are to increase pump life, to help with volume spikes in the system, to even out pump wear, or all of the above. And again, this is optional, but we'd love for you to participate. I'll leave it up for a couple seconds so you can think. Yep, and the correct answer is all of the above. Well done, everyone. So basically all of those things help contribute to why you would use a duplex pump system. Having the option to use one or the other helps to even out the pump wear and to increase the pump life because you're using them less often, as well as if you have any volume spikes coming into the system, being able to use both pumps simultaneously will help to handle that additional volume.
Yeah, I mean, 99% of lift stations are duplex. Some are even triplex. And the other things you can also do, which we didn't kind of mention in the poll question, is which you don't see too much, but you can also do combined flows. So you can say, I want to run both pumps in series to get a higher level flow. You see that a lot where you have a system that would say requires a very specialty pump design that, because obviously pumping technology, just kind of leading into sort of my next kind of conversation here, varies a lot. So if you have there obviously there's a lot of variability between vertical and horizontal, like centrifugal or positive displacement, but certain waste streams, for example, you may need to be looking at things, for example, if you have a high chloride waste stream, into like a large pit, traditional, like sort of like either like, some pumps or things like that are not really viable. You may have to go to like fiberglass, for example, like, self-priming pumps. And then you can also look at doing things like having a combined flow system at that point where you're running both pumps in tandem, sometimes to achieve a higher flow rate. Um, But obviously, this is really based on, this is not even extensive, but just to sort of give people an idea, polypropylene, PVDF, Hastelloy C, lined stainless, fiberglass. There's a lot of different types of materials that can be utilized because you see a lot of different types of waste streams. And you'll see a lot of types of waste streams that, for example, you have, for example, like a thermal waste, you can have a sanitary stainless steel design for a lift station, different carcinogenic waste. You may have like sealed fiberglass with buried tanks, PVDF, if you have, for example, different high temperature waste streams, polypropylene is fairly common. And there's different things that come into this. It can be used for equalization, it can have agitation, double containment. So really, there's a lot of different variety. And they have their different reasons, which is why a lot of times when this can, some ways, designing the actual transfer systems for these various streams is actually more complicated than the actual waste treatment system itself. Most waste streams are going to go underground. They can be double contained. Fitting it, you have a pit, you bury it to the rim. Different kinds of permitting options, things like that will come into play, as well as things like, this is just one example. These are like all Hastelloy C, for example, lift stations are very sort of specialty, kind of like medical device manufacturing, where they're using, very specific types of chemicals. You have solvents and vapors, your explosion-proof environments, as well. And these systems also sometimes need to go into clean room or CGMP spaces. When you have to do that, you have to design what would ultimately be a waste or even a process-based system to really meet that sort of CGMP requirements as well.
Hi, Mark. We had two questions in the Q&A. The first one is what pH sensor options are available and how can we ensure they're reliable and easily maintainable?
So there are a lot of different pH sensors that are available. And they range from, there's obviously different brands. They have pH probes that are designed for general waste, high purity waste, high fluoride waste, softened water, process. They have different connections between flange and thermoplastic, tri-clamp and threaded. They even have self-calibrating and self-cleaning pH probes. A lot of that is and depending on what is chosen, the pH probe can be $300 and it can be $6,000. Just to give you guys kind of a ballpark. So, effectively, my kind of answer to that is it really depends on what your waste stream is and what type of application that you have. What kind of maintenance staff you have, if you want them involved in that, do you want to go with a more robust sort of self-calibrating, self-cleaning setup that also brings like sort of like, like a little mini control box that goes along with the pH probe. If you have very high Wi-Fi water, then we need to look at using the probe is actually designed to basically monitor that because the Wi-Fi water itself can actually drain out the probe and cause it to go out of calibration quicker. So I don't specifically endorse any brands in a webinar like this, but I do think there are probably 7 or 8 that are out there that range from more economical solutions to more process-driven solutions that really depend on what you want to do. Now, from a ease of sort of maintenance, extraction style pH probes, ones that are basically tied into a valve that either goes through the sidewall of the treatment tank or the U-trap or the circulation line are typically ergonomically more easy than having one mounted through the top where now you have the tank is large, for example, in the picture on the screen here, where you have like some 8 foot tall tank to have a probe that has an 8 foot stem attachment on it is obviously more unwieldy, for example, to then take out and calibrate. So for most systems, I'd recommend more of an extraction style pH probe. But that's a very varying, obviously, topic. So there's that itself could be its own webinar, some of the different sort of pH probes that are out there. What I do like to recommend sometimes is redundant pH probes. While pH sensors are considerably smarter than they used to be, say even 10 or 15 years ago, where you can pull alarms, you can pull calibration data out of them, things like that. Yeah, there's a lot of different, and a lot of that is what your guys, what essentially their plan standard is what I would probably defer to, although I could obviously make some recommendations if there's a more specific question related to this offline.
And then the next question mark was, is it possible to treat pH within a lift station as a way to save on footprint?
Yes and no is the answer. I've done it. You can do it. It really depends on what you're effectively doing at that point is you're oversizing your lift station to give you a residency volume. And rather than pumping it as you would traditionally do based on level, you're always holding back a certain equalization volume in the tank at that point. To basically um, maintain a residency time and treatment. So once you have a pH that's basically in spec in your lift station, you can then transfer. Once you go out of spec, you flip it back. You still have a reagent injection assembly that goes with it that can be located sort of above the lift station pit. But yes, you can. It changes how you make a lift station. It changes the sizing of it to typically make it larger. Because now what you're really doing is you're making like a semi-batch pump out pH system that basically goes in pits. Is effectively what you're doing. Um, I've worked on a few projects. The people have done very big ones. They've done 5,000-gallon lift stations that basically operate as both a lift station monitor and as well as a pH system. What you see more of is people will take a pH, they're not sure that they actually need to do pH adjustment. They'll put a pH probe in the lift station to monitor it. So they'll do it more as a pH monitoring point that they can then tie a pH system into down the road, for example. But yes, it can be done. It's a little bit it fundamentally changes how you kind of make a lift station at that point. Because rather than trying to evacuate, you're essentially turning into more of a pH adjustment slash equalization slash transfer system design. Kind of sort of touch on a few different sort of specialty topics here. As I know we kind of draw towards the end. And one of them is if you get involved in some if you have, for example, both CGAMP sort of transfer systems, or if you have basically waste streams that are a little bit of a more different nature, for example. And I kind of use a broad term sort of solvents here, but this can be things like acetones and alcohol, or even other types of very specialty waste, like aerosol waste, things like that, that obviously do not go through like a traditional pH or EDS or systems like that, for example. And they're transferred either to our offsite tanks for haul off, or they're contained for drum off style systems. And these can be more of like a cabinet-based design or non-cabinet-based design. They can be sanitary. They can also be sort of more of an explosion-proof configuration. This is what more of like a cabinet collection sort of waste system would be. Air-driven, this can be drum or tow. This can have different pump out features, but essentially you're filling these types of systems up. You have self-closing doors, you have an environmental control system. If the waste by nature is flammable, this can then also allow you to sort of derate the area around it or have like a fire suppression system as part of it. That can then be utilized to basically remove these types of drums and or totes for better safety and kind of isolation. These can be located inside a building or they can be located outside of a building as well. So there's kind of a lot of different ways to sort of look at these types of systems. This is one example. It's like a 4-drum system. This is actually used more to put fluid into a CGM space, but also can basically be used also as basically as a collection system as well for these types of systems. When you really have waste, it's either not going to be EDS or not going to be pH treated, or it's a chemical like that you're actually going to be utilizing and or needing to haul off site. This is more of a tote-based design, very similar configuration. And really all these do is between tote and drum is you can have basically a larger basically footprint for these types of designs. Then you get into some of the more complicated types of systems. So this one, for example, if you have waste that basically falls under not a biosafety level, but if you have like carcinogenic waste, which is very common in the pharmaceutical industry, or high VOD waste or things like that that are not inherently treated that they need to be segregated. It kind of classifies as sort of a potent waste tank or potent waste systems at that point. These types of systems are treated a little bit differently. These can either be outside or inside large storage tanks. Radioactive tracers can fall into this category as well. That's not as common today as it used to be. You see that a little bit more in the veterinary waste streams where people actually have like isotopes that need to be allowed to kind of go through their half-life. These have different kind of venting requirements. These typically have like an isolated sort of like cam lock monitored panel system so that the operators who are then hooking this up to have this transferred off site can monitor the tank level. They can basically have a proximity switch. There's no contact solution. Um, this allows them to basically haul off effectively these types of short, stronger like waste streams. And then you have like the bio waste system. So if you guys are familiar with more like a thermal kill style systems, this is kind of what the system that actually would feed that. So obviously there's not a very similar sort of capacity to what an actual kill system would look like. You have, fully sanitizable, you have sanitary design tanks, you have jacketed, these can even be heated themselves to be disinfected as part of a maintenance cycle for these types of systems. So this is where you would typically collect things like a BSL-3 or BSL-4 waste that would either go to like a thermal EDS system or be allowed to then go to more of like a potent waste design at that point as well. The other thing is kind of all of these systems. This is kind of been sort of a byproduct of kind of the pandemic, but also sort of kind of new construction. That's still really just to the pharmaceutical industry, but also, kind of in general, people, if you were kind of working in the industry, you've probably seen things like, mobile clean rooms or really taking some of the kind of critical utilities out of the building, effectively making them more of like a sort of self-contained module. And that's really what more of like, this is really what this is. This is more of like a containerized design. Um, where you can build in a full pH system or solvent collection or even transfer systems or even other types of systems, chemical feed as well. And kind of moving away from sort of that skidded design. If you have to put the system outside, this allows you to do that level of treatment. You don't have to worry about things like environmental conditioning. You can do things like do air monitoring. They can have built-in fire suppression. They can have chemical safety showers. And effectively, since most waste streams, for example, are coming out of the building anyways, what this allows you to do is kind of capture that outside of the building where they're kind of bringing it back in and then allowing it to go out to your normal discharge routes. So this kind of gives you sort of another feature. It can also be moved if necessary. It's basically a generator building effectively. So it gives sort of another option. They can also really help expedite if there's a very fast moving project, for example, with the kind of construction that goes along with bringing up a large system into like a sub basement. It's going to occupy and be fully FAT, SAT, everything else, then basically dropped on site at that point. That's really all we have for today. Obviously, Q&A is still open. As I mentioned before, we'll be sending out a brief survey directly following this. We're always interested in your guys' feedback. Really appreciate everyone coming today to our first webinar series of 2026. We do have another one coming up in June. Hopefully nice and warm weather for everybody by then. And that'll be on reverse osmosis and deionization system. So that registration will be open soon. So I hope everyone can join us then. I also want to just kind of announce that we have a new BERT Systems website that's been launched. You can see the link here on screen, as well as in the resource tab. There is a resource tab as part of this webinar that goes through some of this information I talked about, but also a link to the website where you can kind of look at some of the models and things that we were talking about today. And then we also will be sending out an email that will have a copy of this recording for those of you who want to watch it again. And if there's any questions after the Q&A today, we'd be more than happy to answer those. We'd be more than happy to answer those offline.
Hi, Mark. We had a few questions in the Q&A. The first one was, are there certain applications where materials of construction, such as thermoplastic, stainless steel, or Hastelloy, carries any advantage besides for chemical resistance?
Yes and no. So one of the things about stainless steel is if you, for some reason you do have a high temperature stream, obviously you can't use thermoplastic design at that point. Um, large of size makes a difference. So if you have, there are always limitations to how big you want to make a thermoplastic tank as compared to like stainless steel or fiberglass design. If you do want to bury something, say to the rim, for example, if you're thinking a transfer system, then you can also look at utilizing different materials. Haskell you really would only use for its chemical properties as opposed to say, like a traditional stainless steel. But there are a few different reasons to do that as well. So that's the other one I want to bring up is also copolymer. So if you do have something that has to go outside of that is a thermoplastic design, copolymer is a 20% polyethylene, 80% polypropylene blend. Is a much better sort of broader temperature resistance to outside temperatures. Being able to go from like, it's like -30 Fahrenheit to like 180 Fahrenheit, excuse me, over sort of like traditional types of thermoplastics.
And Mark, the next question we had was, what is the impact of Wi-Fi water and how do you determine upfront if bicarbonate is needed for the treatment process?
So I kind of mentioned a little earlier about the alkalinity as part of a waste stream. Um, it can be hard to determine up front, to be honest, because one of the things when you're talking about an overall waste sort of profile in a building, when you have the waste coming in, while you may have Wi-Fi streams or other high purity water sources, they're often combining with other types of waste streams so that you don't really need to worry about that. So typically kind of the red flag is if that's the only thing you're dumping down the drain, then it's definitely worth considering upfront that you want to potentially use that kind of bicarbonate. It's also something that can be added fairly easily to a system after testing. The other thing I caution people is a lot of times, when you need a pH system for a project, you actually take it very early in the building construction because you need to start up your Wi-Fi stills and your other processes in your building, before it goes fully operational. So oftentimes very early on in a project, before you're actually seeing the true nature of the waste, you will sometimes see that need come up because all you're really doing is dumping as you're starting up or you're testing your other systems, all you're basically doing is dumping Wi-Fi water down the drain. So a lot of times people think that they need it very early on in the project, when the truth is they really don't. It's simply a fact that you're basically, in that sort of post-construction phase before they actually put their labs and other processes online, and all they're really doing is just sort of dumping those kind of streams dumping down kind of the startup streams, most of their critical utilities down the drain.
And Mark, another question we had was what factors influence EDS transfer system design?
Depends on the BSL level. So if you're talking about things that are BSL, one, maybe even two, not a lot has to necessarily go into that. You're talking about something which is relatively benign by most standards. The most common things, most of the time you're talking about, like, for example, like a chemical sort of lift station, for example, it can have an open vent, it can be vented to the atmosphere, things like that. Biosafety, you typically need to have vent filtration on there. You need to have, if you put vent filtration on there, like the porosity of that, whether it's a HEPA filter, things like that come into play as part of the system. Once you're into more BSL3, especially BSL4, now it's a sanitary design, because it itself needs to be disinfected, as part of any kind of routine maintenance on there. So you don't want it's obviously to become, a source of potentially a biohazard. So then you have pressure vessels, you have one similar stuff that you would see in kind of a cooker chemicals. So it's essentially sort of an EVS cooker system, like that vent to relieve rupture discs, things like that. Full drainability, things like that start to come into play. It's part of the transfer system that goes into an EVS system. Thank you, everyone. Like I said, we'll be sending out a survey here soon. If there's any questions that come up after the fact, you can feel free to email the Bird Process team, and we'll be more than happy to answer your questions. I look forward to seeing hopefully everybody here again in June.